plane hit the mountain at 9:47 a.m. on June 3, 1984. 6 people died. The official report said pilot error. For 40 years, everyone believed it. Then a climber found an orange box in the rocks, pressed the play button, and heard the pilot's last words. "Engines running but controls aren't responding. Someone cut the cables." The aircraft was a Piper PA-31. Navajo twin-engine, built in 1978. Registration number November 738 Charlie. It belonged to Mountain Air Charter, a small operation based in Boise that flew cargo, mail, and occasional passengers across Idaho's backcountry. The plane had logged 4,300 hours, routine maintenance every 100 hours, clean inspection record. The pilot was Derek Chen, 42, 18 years of flight experience, ATP license, no incidents. The co-pilot was Jessica Ruiz, 31, commercial license, 7 years flying charter, 4 passengers. Martin Kowalski, 53, a mining consultant. His assistant Rachel Voss, 28. Thomas and Linda Garrett, both 61, retired school teachers, heading to their cabin near McCall. They departed Boise at 8:52 a.m. Flight plan filed for McCall Municipal Airport, 73 nautical miles north. Weather, clear. Visibility 15 miles. Winds light. Estimated flight time, 38 minutes. Derek radioed Boise Tower at 8:54 a.m. Routine departure call. Everything normal. He radioed again at 9:12 a.m. 22 miles north, climbing through 7,500 feet, on course. That was the last transmission anyone heard. At 9:47 a.m., hikers near Payette National Forest heard a sound like thunder. They looked up and saw smoke rising from a ridgeline 3 miles west. One of them had a CB radio. He called the county sheriff. The sheriff dispatched search and rescue. The first responders reached the crash site at 11:30 a.m. The wreckage was scattered across a quarter-mile slope. Pieces of fuselage and wing embedded in pine trees and granite. The tail section had separated on impact. The cockpit was crushed against a rock face. There was no fire, too much rock, not enough fuel spillage. They found 6 bodies, all dead on impact. The coroner later confirmed blunt force trauma, no survivors. The National Transportation Safety Board sent investigators on June 4th. They spent 5 days at the site, photographing, measuring, collecting pieces. They interviewed Mountain Air Charter's mechanics, reviewed maintenance logs, checked Derek Chen's flight history. They examined the wreckage for mechanical failure, control cables, hydraulic lines, engine mounts. On June 9th, the lead investigator, a man named Paul Hendricks, filed a preliminary report. He noted that both engines appeared functional at impact. Propellers showed rotation marks, consistent with power. The fuel system was intact. No evidence of structural failure. But the control cables, the steel wires that connected the yoke to the rudder, ailerons, and elevator, were frayed and severed in multiple places. Paul's conclusion: the cables had failed due to age and stress. The plane had lost controllability. Derek had tried to glide it down, but the terrain gave him no options. Pilot error wasn't the primary cause, but Derek should have noticed the cable wear during pre-flight. Mountain Air Charter should have caught it during maintenance. The final NTSB report was issued on September 14, 1984. Probable cause: failure of primary flight control cables due to inadequate maintenance inspection, resulting in loss of aircraft control and collision with terrain. Contributing factor: pilots' delayed recognition of control degradation. Mountain Air Charter's insurance paid out. The FAA fined the company $12,000 for maintenance violations. The families of the 6 victims filed lawsuits. Settlements were reached quietly. The crash faded from the news. Derek Chen's widow, Lisa, never believed the report. She'd been married to Derek for 16 years. She knew how he flew, methodical, cautious, obsessive about pre-flight checks. She'd watched him walk around a plane for 20 minutes, checking every bolt, every hinge, every surface. He wouldn't have missed frayed cables. Lisa hired a lawyer and requested access to the wreckage. The NTSB said the investigation was closed. The wreckage had been released to the insurance company, which had sold it for scrap. Lisa asked for the cockpit voice recorder. The NTSB said the plane hadn't been equipped with one. It was a small charter, not required by regulation. Lisa tried to find the flight data recorder. Same answer: not required. Not installed. She wrote letters to the FAA, to her congressman, to the NTSB chairman. She got polite replies, and no action. By 1986, she'd exhausted her options. She moved to Seattle with her 2 daughters, and tried to rebuild her life. 40 years passed. On May 18, 2024, a climber named Aaron Delgado was ascending a ridge in the Payette National Forest. Aaron was 29, a software engineer from Boise, who climbed on weekends. He'd been working his way through Idaho's peaks, checking them off a list. This particular ridge, unnamed elevation 7,800 feet, wasn't on any official trail, but Aaron liked the solitude. At around 10:30 a.m., Aaron was scrambling over a boulder field when he noticed something wedged between 2 rocks. It was small, bright orange, partially buried in lichen and pine needles. Aaron knelt and brushed away the debris. The object was a rectangular box, about the size of a lunchbox, made of hard plastic. One corner was cracked, but the casing was intact. Aaron picked it up and turned it over. On the side, stamped in black letters, cockpit voice recorder, do not open. Below that, a serial number CVR 8401N738C. Aaron stared at the box. He'd heard about plane crashes in the area, old stories, decades-old tragedies. He pulled out his phone and took a photo. Then he carefully placed the recorder in his backpack and continued his climb. That evening, Aaron Googled the serial number. He found a match: Piper PA-31 Navajo, registration N738C, crashed June 3, 1984. 6 fatalities. Probable cause: control cable failure. Aaron read the NTSB report. It said the plane hadn't been equipped with a cockpit voice recorder, but Aaron was holding one. He called the NTSB regional office in Seattle on May 20th. A record specialist named Karen Tully answered. Aaron explained what he'd found. Karen said she'd look into it and call him back. Karen called back 2 hours later. She said she'd reviewed the case file. The aircraft owner, Mountain Air Charter, had never registered a CVR installation. The NTSB investigators in 1984 had searched the wreckage and found no recorder. Karen asked Aaron to describe the device. Aaron described the orange box, the serial number, the condition. Karen was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Can you bring it to Boise? We need to examine it." Aaron drove to Boise on May 21st and met Karen at the FAA field office. She wore gloves when she handled the recorder. She photographed it from every angle, documented the serial number, and placed it in a padded case. She thanked Aaron and said the NTSB would contact him if they had questions. Karen sent the recorder to the NTSB lab in Washington, D.C. The lab received it on May 24th. A technician named Robert Ming examined the device. The outer casing was weathered but structurally sound. The internal components, magnetic tape, circuit boards, power supply, were corroded but potentially recoverable. Robert estimated a 60% chance of retrieving usable audio. The lab began the extraction process on May 27th. They used specialized tools to disassemble the recorder without damaging the tape. They cleaned the tape heads, tested the circuitry, and ran the tape through a digital transfer system. On May 30th, Robert called Karen Tully. He said they'd recovered audio, 31 minutes of cockpit conversation, starting at 8:50 a.m. on June 3, 1984, and ending at 9:47 a.m., the moment of impact. Karen requested a copy of the audio. Robert sent it via encrypted file transfer. Karen listened to the recording in her office on May 31st. She listened twice. Then she called her supervisor. The recording began with routine chatter. Derek Chen and Jessica Ruiz going through pre-flight checks, joking about the weather, discussing the route. At 8:52 a.m., Derek radioed Boise Tower for departure clearance. At 9:12 a.m., he radioed again. Everything normal. At 9:34 a.m., Derek said, "Feel that?" Jessica replied, "What?" Derek, "Yoke's a little mushy." Aileron response. Jessica, "Want to turn back?" Derek, "Let me try something." There was a pause. The sound of the yoke moving. Derek said, "Yeah, definitely sluggish. But we're 20 minutes out. We'll report it when we land." At 9:41 a.m. Derek said, "Okay, that's not right." Jessica, "What's wrong?" Derek, "Rudder's not responding. I'm pushing. Nothing's happening." Jessica, "Engine trouble." Derek, No, engines are fine. It's the controls. At 9:43 a.m., Derek's voice changed. Calm but urgent. Jessica, I've lost the ailerons. Yoke's not doing anything. Jessica, what do you mean? Derek, I mean I'm moving the yoke and the plane's not responding. Try yours. There was a pause. The sound of the co-pilot's yoke moving. Jessica said, mine's dead too. Derek, okay. We're going to glide this in. Throttle back. Keep us level. At 9:45 a.m. Derek said, elevator's gone. I can't control pitch. Jessica's voice, rising. What's happening? Derek, the cables. The control cables. They're severed. Jessica, how is that possible? Derek, I don't know, but we're going down. At 9:46 a.m., Derek radioed a mayday call. His voice was steady, professional. Mayday, 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 November 738 Charlie. We've lost flight controls. All control surfaces unresponsive. Descending. Position approximately 15 miles south of McCall. 6 souls on board. There was no response from any tower. Derek repeated the call. Jessica said, why isn't anyone answering? Derek said, I don't know. Try the radio. Jessica's voice, it's set to the right frequency. I don't understand. Derek said, we're out of time. Brace for impact. At 9:47 a.m. there was a sound like tearing metal. Then silence. But 17 seconds before impact, Derek had said something else. Something Karen Tully played 5 times to make sure she'd heard it correctly. Derek's voice, barely above a whisper. Engines running but controls aren't responding. Someone cut the cables. Karen saved the audio file and forwarded it to the NTSB's Office of Aviation Safety. She attached a memo. Recovered CVR contradicts 1984 findings. Recommend reopening investigation. The NTSB assigned a senior investigator, a woman named Margaret Ortiz, to review the case. Margaret had been with the NTSB for 23 years, specializing in mechanical failure analysis. She read the 1984 report, listened to the CVR audio, and requested the original wreckage documentation. The documentation was archived in a storage facility in Denver. It took 2 weeks to locate the files. Margaret received them on June 18, 2024. She spread the photos and diagrams across her desk and studied them. The control cables in the wreckage had been severed in 4 locations. 2 on the aileron cables, 1 on the rudder cable, 1 on the elevator cable. The 1984 investigators had attributed the failures to wear and stress, but Margaret noticed something in the photos. The cable ends were frayed, but not uniformly. Some strands showed clean cuts, as if sliced with a blade. Other strands showed tearing, consistent with tension failure. Margaret called the 1984 lead investigator, Paul Hendricks. He was 71 now, retired, living in Portland. Margaret asked if he remembered the cable failures. Paul said he did. He said the cables had been old, beyond their recommended service life. Margaret asked if he'd considered sabotage. Paul was silent for a moment. Then he said, no, why would I? It was a charter plane. No motive. Margaret thanked him and hung up. She requested the original cable samples from the wreckage. The NTSB archives team searched for 3 days. They found most of the wreckage had been scrapped, but a few components had been retained for training purposes. One of those components was a section of aileron cable, 12 inches long, labeled N738C, right aileron, failed section. The cable arrived at the NTSB lab on June 25. Margaret examined it under a microscope. The cable consisted of 19 individual wire strands, twisted together. 15 strands showed tearing, consistent with tension failure, but 4 strands showed clean cuts, perpendicular to the wire axis. The cuts were smooth, precise, made with a sharp tool. Margaret photographed the cuts and sent the images to a metallurgist at MIT. The metallurgist, Dr. Alan Ross, examined the photos and called Margaret on June 28. He said the cuts were consistent with a carbide or diamond-tipped blade, something designed to cut steel wire. The cuts had been made before the cable failed, not during the crash. Margaret filed a report with the NTSB on July 1. Her conclusion: the control cables on N738C had been deliberately cut, either partially or fully, before the flight. The cuts had weakened the cables, causing them to fail mid-flight. The 1984 investigation had missed the sabotage, because the investigators had assumed the failures were accidental. The NTSB reopened the case on July 3, 2024. They issued a press release. New evidence suggests the 1984 crash of N738C may have been the result of deliberate interference with flight controls. Investigation ongoing. The press release made headlines. Lisa Chen, now 74, living in Seattle, saw the news on her phone. She called the NTSB immediately. She spoke to Margaret Ortiz. Lisa said she'd always known Derek hadn't made a mistake. She asked what happened next. Margaret said they were investigating. She said they needed to determine who had access to the plane before the flight. Lisa said, "I've waited 40 years. I can wait a little longer." Margaret requested Mountain Air Charter's employee records from June 1984. The company had gone out of business in 1989, but the FAA had archived personnel files. Margaret received the records on July 8. She found 12 employees, 2 pilots, 1 dispatcher, 4 mechanics, 3 administrative staff, and 2 line service workers who fueled and prepped the planes. Margaret cross-referenced the names with criminal databases, financial records, and FAA violation histories. 11 of the 12 had clean records. The 12th, a line service worker named Gary Tillman, had been arrested in 1986 for theft and served 8 months in jail. After his release, he'd moved to Nevada and worked as a truck mechanic. He died in 2019. Margaret contacted Gary's former supervisor at Mountain Air Charter, a man named Ed Vasquez, now 81, living in Boise. Ed remembered Gary. He said Gary had been a decent worker, quiet, kept to himself. But Ed also remembered something odd. In early June 1984, Gary had been reprimanded for accessing a plane without authorization. Ed had found Gary in the hangar late one evening, standing near N738C with a toolbox. Gary had said he was checking a fuel line. Ed had told him to leave the plane alone. Mechanics handled repairs, not line service. Margaret asked if Ed had reported the incident. Ed said no, it hadn't seemed serious at the time. Margaret requested Gary Tillman's employment records. She found he'd been hired in March 1984 and terminated in August 1984. 2 months after the crash, the termination reason poor performance and unauthorized access to aircraft. Margaret tracked down Gary's relatives. His younger brother, Stephen Tillman, lived in Reno. Margaret called Stephen on July 12 and asked if Gary had ever mentioned the crash. Stephen said Gary had talked about it once, a few years before he died. Gary had been drunk, rambling. He'd said something about the plane that went down, and they never knew. Stephen had asked what he meant. Gary had said, "I did what I was told. They paid me. I didn't know people would die." Stephen had assumed Gary was talking nonsense. He hadn't pressed further. Margaret asked if Gary had kept any records, any documents from that time. Stephen said Gary had left a storage unit in Reno when he died. Stephen still had the key but hadn't cleaned it out. Margaret flew to Reno on July 15. Stephen met her at the storage facility. The unit was small, filled with boxes of old clothes, tools, and paperwork. Margaret spent 3 hours searching. In a box at the back, she found a manila envelope. Inside, a cashier's check for $15,000, dated May 28, 1984. The memo line read, "Services rendered." The check had been issued by a bank in Salt Lake City. Margaret photographed the check and traced the account. The bank records showed the account had been opened in May 1984 by a man named Victor Hale. The account had been closed in June 1984, after issuing a single check. Margaret ran Victor Hale through every database she had. She found nothing, no address, no phone, no employment history. The name was fake, but the check had been cashed. Gary Tillman had deposited it in his personal account on June 1, 1984, 2 days before the crash. Margaret returned to Washington, D.C. on July 18. She briefed the NTSB chairman. She said the evidence pointed to a deliberate act. Someone had paid Gary Tillman $15,000 to sabotage N738C. The sabotage had been designed to cause a mid-flight failure, making it look like an accident. The chairman asked the obvious question, why? Margaret didn't have an answer. She said they needed to identify the passengers and determine if any of them had been targets. Margaret reviewed the passenger manifest. Martin Kowalski, mining consultant. Rachel Voss, his assistant. Thomas and Linda Garrett, retired teachers. She ran background checks on all four. Martin Kowalski had been 53 at the time of the crash. He'd worked for Apex Mining Solutions, a consulting firm based in Denver, his specialty evaluating mineral deposits, advising on extraction feasibility. In 1984, Apex had been hired by a Canadian company called Northridge Resources to assess a potential copper mine site in northern Idaho. Margaret contacted Apex Mining Solutions. The company still existed, though under new ownership. An archivist searched the files and found Martin's work from 1984. He'd completed a preliminary survey of the Northridge site in May 1984. His report, dated May 22, concluded that the site contained significant copper deposits, estimated value $200 million. But Martin had also noted something else. The site was located near a watershed that supplied drinking water to 3 towns. Mining operations would require chemical processing that could contaminate the water supply. Martin had recommended that Northridge conduct environmental impact studies before proceeding. He'd flagged the contamination risk in bold letters. Margaret requested Northridge Resources records. The company had dissolved in 1987, but corporate filings were archived in British Columbia. Margaret found board meeting minutes from June 1984. The minutes showed that Northridge's executives had been furious about Martin's report. They'd viewed the environmental concerns as obstacles, not legitimate issues. One executive had written in an internal memo, "Kowalski is costing us millions. We need a second opinion." But there was no record of Northridge hiring another consultant. Margaret dug deeper. She found a newspaper article from July 1984, 1 month after the crash, announcing that Northridge had sold the Idaho mining rights to a subsidiary called Clearwater Extraction. The sale price, $43 million. Clearwater had immediately begun development, bypassing environmental reviews by claiming the site fell under a regulatory exemption for small-scale operations. Margaret checked the ownership records for Clearwater Extraction. The company had been incorporated in May 1984, 3 weeks before Martin Kowalski's death. The sole shareholder, a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. Margaret couldn't trace the holding company's owners. The records were sealed. But she found something else. In 1986, Clearwater Extraction had been fined by the EPA for contaminating the watershed near the Idaho mine. The fine had been $3 million. Clearwater had paid it and continued operations. By 1990, the mine had extracted over $180 million worth of copper. Margaret called the FBI on July 22. She briefed a special agent named Daniel Cross. She laid out the evidence: the sabotaged plane, the payoff to Gary Tillman, Martin Kowalski's report, Northridge's financial interest, the suspicious timing of Clearwater Extraction's formation. Daniel said it looked like a case of corporate murder for hire. He said the FBI would open an investigation. He said proving it after 40 years would be difficult. Most of the people involved were likely dead or untraceable. Margaret asked if they'd pursue it anyway. Daniel said they would. The FBI investigation began on July 25. Agents interviewed former Northridge employees, reviewed financial records, and searched for connections between Northridge and Gary Tillman. They found none. The payment to Gary had been laundered through Victor Hale's fake account. The account's funding trail led to a series of offshore transfers, ending in the Cayman Islands. On August 8, the FBI identified one Northridge executive who was still alive, Douglas Merrick, 82, living in Vancouver. Douglas had been Northridge's CFO in 1984. Agents flew to Vancouver on August 10 and interviewed him. Douglas denied any knowledge of sabotage. He said the company had been disappointed with Martin's report, but they'd never considered violence. He said Northridge had simply moved on and sold the rights to Clearwater. He said he didn't know who owned Clearwater. The agents asked if Douglas had authorized any payments to contractors in May or June 1984. Douglas said he didn't recall. The agents showed him the cashier's check issued to Gary Tillman. Douglas stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't sign this." The agents asked who could have authorized it. Douglas said, "The CEO, Victor." The agents asked for Victor's full name. Douglas said, "Victor Hale." The agents froze. Victor Hale, the name on the fake account. Douglas said Victor had been Northridge's CEO from 1982 to 1985. He'd resigned abruptly in 1985 and moved to Europe. Douglas hadn't heard from him since. The agents asked if Douglas had contact information for Victor. Douglas said no, but he remembered Victor's wife, Her name was Claire Hale. She'd lived in Vancouver until the early 1990s, then moved to Seattle. The FBI traced Claire Hale to a retirement community in Seattle. Agents visited her on August 15th. Claire was 79, frail, living in assisted care. She said Victor had died in 2003. She said he'd never talked about his work. She said he'd been a private man, distant, always traveling. The agents asked if Victor had kept any records. Claire said she'd boxed up his belongings after he died and stored them in a unit in Seattle. She gave the agents the address. The agents searched the unit on August 16th. They found boxes of financial records, travel logs, and personal papers. In one box they found a leather-bound notebook. Inside, Victor had kept a journal. The entry dated May 27, 1984, read, "Kowalski's report is a problem. Too detailed, too cautious. Board wants him silenced. I've made arrangements. Cost $15. K timeline, 1 week." The entry dated June 4, 1984, one day after the crash, read, "Problem resolved. Plane went down as planned. Kowalski dead, no survivors. Clearwater deal moves forward." The FBI seized the notebook and submitted it as evidence. On August 20th, they referred the case to the Justice Department. The DOJ reviewed the evidence and concluded that while Victor Hale had clearly orchestrated the sabotage, he was dead. Gary Tillman was dead. Northridge Resources was dissolved. There was no one left to prosecute. The DOJ issued a statement on August 25th. The FBI's investigation confirms that the 1984 crash of N-738C was the result of deliberate sabotage ordered by Northridge Resources CEO Victor Hale. The sabotage was motivated by financial interests related to a mining project. All responsible parties are deceased. The case is closed. Lisa Chen read the statement in her living room in Seattle. She sat in silence for a long time. Then she called her daughters and told them Derek hadn't made a mistake. He'd been murdered. On September 1st, the NTSB held a press conference. Margaret Ortiz stood at a podium and summarized the findings. She said the 1984 investigation had been flawed but understandable. Sabotage had not been considered because there'd been no obvious motive. She said the CVR recovery had been critical. She thanked Aaron Delgado for finding it. A reporter asked if the families would receive compensation. Margaret said that was a legal question, not an NTSB matter. But she noted that Clearwater Extraction, now owned by a multinational corporation, still operated mines in Idaho. The families could pursue civil litigation. Lisa Chen hired a lawyer. On September 15th, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Clearwater Extraction's parent company. The lawsuit sought damages for Derek's death, as well as punitive damages for the 40-year cover-up. The company settled on November 3, 2024. Terms were confidential, but sources close to the case said the settlement exceeded $10 million. Lisa donated half the settlement to a scholarship fund in Derek's name. The fund would support aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities. The other half she split among the families of the other 5 victims. On December 3rd, Lisa traveled to Idaho. She hiked to the crash site with Margaret Ortiz and Aaron Delgado. The site was remote, still marked by fragments of metal embedded in the trees. Lisa stood at the spot where the cockpit had hit the rock face. She placed a small bronze plaque on a boulder. The plaque read, "In memory of Derek Chen, Jessica Ruiz, Martin Kowalski, Rachel Voss, Thomas Garrett, and Linda Garrett, murdered June 3, 1984. Truth revealed June 2024. Lisa stepped back and looked at the mountains. She thought about the 40 years she'd spent wondering, questioning, doubting herself. She thought about the NTSB report that had blamed Derek. She thought about the people who'd sabotaged the plane and lived their lives while her husband lay buried in this forest. Margaret stood beside her. He knew, Margaret said quietly. In those last seconds, he knew someone had cut the cables. And now everyone else knows too. Lisa nodded. He deserved that. They all did. Aaron Delgado stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the orange recorder he'd found wedged in the rocks. He thought about how close it had come to being lost forever. Another 40 years, another 100, eroded by weather, buried by landslides, forgotten. But he'd found it. And because of that, 6 people who'd been murdered were finally recognized as victims, not statistics. Lisa turned to Aaron. "Thank you," she said. "You gave him his voice back." Aaron didn't know what to say. He just nodded. They hiked down the mountain together. As the sun set over the Payette National Forest, the trees cast long shadows. The air smelled like pine and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. The crash site would remain, a quiet scar on the mountain. And the truth, after 40 years, was finally enough. Did Victor Hale ever feel guilt for what he'd done? Or do some people justify anything when money's involved?